The day Clara spent her last $9 on a crumbling clock tower was the same day she stopped waiting for her life to be returned to her and started stealing it back, piece by broken piece, from the ruins they left behind. It had only been 3 weeks since everything collapsed, though to Clara it felt like years stitched together by sleepless nights and hollow mornings. One moment she had been standing in her kitchen, rinsing dishes in warm, soapy water, listening to the familiar hum of a life she believed was stable, and the next she was staring at her husband's reflection in the window as he calmly told her he was leaving. Not for someone new, not for a stranger, but for her younger sister, the same girl Clara had helped raise, protected, forgiven too many times, and loved without conditions. And even then Clara hadn't reacted the way people might expect. There was no screaming, no dramatic collapse, just a quiet, disbelieving stillness as if her mind refused to translate the words into something real, until she turned and saw the suitcase by the door and her sister standing beside it, unable to meet her eyes. And that was when something inside Clara didn't break. It simply went silent. The days that followed were worse than the moment itself, because betrayal, she learned, wasn't loud. It was administrative. It came in paperwork and signatures, in quiet conversations she was excluded from, in bank accounts she suddenly couldn't access, in a house that was no longer legally hers. And by the end of the week, she had been erased from her own life with terrifying efficiency, left with a small duffel bag of clothes and a handful of personal items that felt meaningless now, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. And what hurt most wasn't just losing her husband or her home. It was the realization that no one chose her side. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided her, even distant relatives offered polite silence instead of support, as though her pain was inconvenient, something easier to ignore than acknowledge. And so Clara drifted, from one cheap motel to another, counting coins, skipping meals, convincing herself each night that tomorrow would somehow be different, though she had no idea how, until eventually tomorrow stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like a threat. On the 21st day, with exhaustion clinging to her bones and hunger tightening its grip, she found herself sitting on a cracked wooden bench at the edge of a part of town she didn't recognize, a place where buildings leaned into each other like they were too tired to stand alone. And she pulled out her wallet with trembling hands, already knowing what she would find but needing to see it anyway. And there it was, $9, a single crumpled bill and a few coins, the final measure of everything she had left in the world. And she stared at it for a long time, not crying, not even angry, just empty, as if the number itself had confirmed something she had been trying not to believe, that this was it. This was the end of whatever her life had been before, and maybe even the end of whatever it could have been. And she might have stayed there longer, lost in that quiet surrender, if not for the sound that broke through her thoughts, faint at first, almost imagined, a soft metallic chime echoing somewhere in the distance, uneven and strained, like something trying to remember how to function. And Clara lifted her head, scanning the street until her eyes landed on it. A tall, skeletal structure rising above the surrounding decay, a clock tower, old and neglected, its face cracked and clouded with dirt, its hands frozen in place at 3:17, as though time itself had given up inside it. And yet she had heard it. She was sure of it, that faint chime, and beneath the tower, barely visible through the weeds and rust, was a sign hanging crookedly from a bent post. The letters faded but still readable if you looked closely enough. Auction today. Minimum bid. $9. And Clara let out a small, humorless breath. Because of course it was $9. Of course the universe would reduce her choices to something this absurd, by a decaying piece of history, or hold on to money that wouldn't even last her another day. And for a moment she considered walking away, finding somewhere else to sit, somewhere else to wait for whatever came next. But her feet didn't move, because there was something about the tower that held her attention, something beyond its broken exterior. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt paused, like a story that had been interrupted mid-sentence. And without fully deciding to, Clara stood up and crossed the street, each step slow, deliberate, as though she were approaching something that might disappear if she moved too quickly. And as she got closer, she noticed a man standing near the base of the tower, flipping through a clipboard with the kind of bored detachment that suggested he had been waiting all day for someone who wasn't coming. He glanced up as she approached, his expression shifting slightly in surprise before settling into mild curiosity. "You here for the auction?" he asked, and Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her wallet. "I only have $9, she said, her voice quieter than she intended, and the man shrugged, as if that was the least unusual thing he'd heard all day. "That's the minimum," he replied, tapping the clipboard. "No one else has shown up, so if you want it, it's yours." And Clara turned her gaze back to the tower, taking in its cracked stone, its broken windows, the way it leaned ever so slightly to one side, as if resisting gravity out of sheer stubbornness, and she saw herself in it, not as she had been before, but as she was now, discarded, overlooked, assumed to be beyond saving. And something inside her stirred, not hope exactly, but a refusal to disappear quietly, and before she could overthink it, before doubt could reclaim its hold, she reached into her wallet, pulled out the last of her money, and placed it in the man's hand. "I'll take it," she said. And just like that, with $9 and nothing left to lose, Clara became the owner of a broken clock tower that no one else wanted, unaware that in choosing it, she had just made the first decision in weeks that belonged entirely to her, and that somewhere inside those silent, rusted gears, something had already begun to move. The first night inside the clock tower felt less like shelter and more like a test Clara wasn't sure she could pass, because the moment the sun disappeared and the shadows stretched long across the cracked stone walls, the place seemed to come alive in all the wrong ways. The wind didn't just blow, it whispered through the broken windows in long, hollow sighs, slipping between the gaps in the structure like it knew every weakness, every fracture, every place time had already claimed, and the wooden staircase that spiraled upward groaned under the slightest pressure, each step protesting her presence, as though reminding her she didn't belong there yet. And Clara sat on the cold floor near the entrance, her back against the wall, her duffel bag clutched close like it still held something valuable, staring into the darkness as doubt crept in with brutal clarity. Because what had she actually done? She had traded her last $9, her final safety net, for a ruin, a hollow shell that couldn't protect her from the cold, couldn't feed her, couldn't even guarantee it wouldn't collapse while she slept. And for a long time she said nothing, just listened to the tower breathe around her, until the silence grew so heavy it felt like it might crush her from the inside out. "This was a mistake," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible, and the words lingered in the air as if the tower itself had heard them. And maybe that was why she noticed it, or maybe it would have happened anyway, but sometime deep into the night, when exhaustion had dulled her thoughts and she was on the edge of sleep, she heard it. A single, sharp, unmistakable sound. Tick, and Clara's eyes snapped open, her body going completely still as she tried to convince herself it was just the wind, just loose debris shifting somewhere above her. But then it came again. Tick, slightly louder this time, deliberate, rhythmic, impossible to ignore, and she pushed herself up slowly, her heart beginning to race as she looked toward the center of the tower where the massive clock mechanism was housed several levels above. "No, that's not," she muttered under her breath, because she had seen it earlier, rusted solid, frozen in place like it hadn't moved in decades. And yet there it was again. Tick, and before fear could root her in place, she grabbed the small flashlight from her bag and started up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight as she climbed higher and higher, following the sound, until she reached the chamber where the mechanism sat, a tangled mass of gears and rods coated in dust and corrosion, and she held the light steady, scanning every inch of it, waiting for it to move again. But for a moment nothing happened, the silence returning so suddenly it almost felt like a trick, and Clara let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly. "You're losing it," she murmured, turning to go back down, when suddenly, right in front of her, one of the smallest gears shifted, just a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. Tick, and Clara froze, her breath catching as she stared at it, not moving, not blinking, afraid that if she did it would stop again. And then it moved once more, a tiny, stubborn motion against the weight of rust and time, and something inside her responded in a way she couldn't fully explain, because it wasn't just surprise or confusion, it was recognition, like seeing a reflection of herself in something that should have been completely lifeless. And without thinking she stepped closer, reaching out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. "You're not supposed to work," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost gentle, as if she were speaking to something fragile rather than broken. And the gear didn't respond. Not immediately, but the moment stayed with her, settling somewhere deep inside where the emptiness had been. And when she finally made her way back down and curled up against the wall again, the fear hadn't disappeared, but it had changed, softened into something quieter, something that didn't feel quite as final. The next morning, Clara woke with a stiffness in her body that reminded her she wasn't young anymore. Her back aching, her hands cold, her situation still very real, but the memory of that single ticking sound lingered, refusing to fade. And instead of leaving, instead of walking away and trying to salvage what little she could from the outside world, she stood up, brushed the dust from her clothes, and looked around the tower with new eyes. Not as something that had defeated her, but as something unfinished. And that was when she started cleaning, not with any grand plan or expectation of success, but because she needed to do something, anything, that wasn't sitting still and waiting for her life to end quietly. And the work was harder than she anticipated, every surface coated in years of neglect, every corner hiding debris, broken wood, and remnants of what the tower used to be. But Clara worked through it, slowly, methodically, using her hands when she had no tools, dragging out what she could, clearing space where there had been none. And as the hours passed, she found small things that felt like victories. A patch of floor that wasn't completely rotted, a section of wall that still held firm, a window that, once wiped clean, allowed sunlight to spill through in thin, golden beams that cut through the gloom. And she paused there for a moment, standing in that light, letting it warm her face. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely invisible. Days blurred together after that, each one marked by effort and exhaustion, her body protesting more with every movement. But she didn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling everything she had been trying to survive. And somewhere in the middle of that relentless routine, she began to notice something else. Not just the occasional tick of the mechanism above, but the way the tower seemed to respond to her presence, subtle at first, almost imagined, like the wind shifting direction just as she secured a broken panel, or the faint echo of a chime when she cleared a section near the base, as if the structure itself was waking up in fragments, piece by piece, alongside her. And it was during one of those long afternoons, while clearing out a narrow space beneath the spiral staircase, that she found it, a small, hidden door, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust and debris, its edges worn smooth with age. And Clara hesitated before opening it, a strange sense of anticipation settling in her chest, before she finally pulled it open to reveal a compact workshop tucked away inside, filled with old tools, shelves lined with forgotten parts, and in the center, a workbench covered in scattered papers and a single, leather-bound journal. And her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, brushing off the dust, opening it to the first page, where faded handwriting greeted her in careful, deliberate strokes. "To whoever finds this tower is not broken, only waiting." And Clara felt something shift again, deeper this time, as she turned the page, her eyes scanning the words that followed, each line pulling her further into a story that wasn't hers, and yet somehow felt like it was leading directly to her, as if every step she had taken since that bench, since those $9, had brought her exactly where she was meant to be. And for the first time since everything had been taken from her, Clara didn't feel like she had nothing. She felt like she had found something fragile and uncertain, but real enough to hold on to. And as she closed the journal and looked around the tower again, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt patient, like it was waiting to see what she would do next. The first time the clock tower chimed properly, it didn't just break the silence. It broke something open inside Clara that she hadn't realized was still locked away, because for months she had been living in a world where time felt meaningless, where days blurred into each other without purpose, where nothing moved forward no matter how much she endured. And yet on that morning, standing at the top of the tower with grease-stained hands and aching bones, she heard it. Clear, strong, undeniable, a single chime that echoed out across the empty streets below. rolling through the air like a declaration that something long forgotten had finally remembered how to exist again, and Clara froze, her breath catching as the sound lingered, vibrating through the structure beneath her feet. And then came another chime, and another, each one steadier than the last, until the tower that had once stood silent and abandoned was suddenly alive, marking time as if it had never stopped, and Clara felt tears rise to her eyes, not from sadness, but from something far more overwhelming. Because for the first time since her life had fallen apart, she could feel movement again, not just in the gears above her, but within herself, as though every small, stubborn effort she had made had led to this moment. And she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You actually did it," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was speaking to the tower or to herself, and the sound carried further than she expected, drawing attention in ways she hadn't planned for, because people heard it. People who had lived nearby for years without ever noticing the tower suddenly looked up, confused, curious, pulled by something they couldn't quite explain. And at first it was just a man who wandered closer that afternoon, standing at the base and staring up at the clock face like he was trying to confirm it was real. And Clara watched him from the doorway, unsure of what to say, until he finally asked, "Did you fix it?" And she hesitated before answering, "I tried." And that seemed to be enough, because he nodded slowly and sat down on the steps without another word, staying there for nearly an hour before leaving. And the next day someone else came, a woman with tired eyes who stepped inside quietly, looking around as if she expected to be turned away. But Clara didn't ask her anything, didn't question her presence. She simply stepped aside and let her be, and the woman lingered for a while, running her fingers along the walls, glancing up at the staircase, before eventually sitting on one of the old wooden benches Clara had repaired. And when she left, she whispered a soft, "Thank you," that caught Clara off guard, because she hadn't done anything. Not really. And yet somehow it had meant something. And that's how it began. Not with intention, not with a plan, but with a series of small, quiet moments that built into something neither Clara nor the tower had been before, because people kept coming, not in crowds, not all at once, but steadily, each one carrying their own version of brokenness, their own reasons for needing a place where they didn't have to explain themselves. And Clara never asked questions. She didn't need to. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same emptiness she had carried not long ago, and she gave them what she had once needed, a space to exist without judgment, without pressure, without being told to move on before they were ready. And in return, something unexpected happened. They began to help. A man brought tools and repaired sections of the railing Clara hadn't been able to fix. A woman returned with paint and quietly transformed the dull, cracked walls into something warmer, something alive. Someone else left bags of food near the entrance without waiting to be thanked. And over time the tower changed, not just structurally, but in spirit, becoming less of a ruin and more of a refuge, a place where time didn't feel like an enemy, but something that could be reclaimed, moment by moment, choice by choice. And Clara found herself at the center of it without ever trying to be, not as a leader, not as someone in control, but as someone who had simply started something when she had nothing left to lose. And it was nearly a year later, on an evening painted in soft gold and fading light, when the past finally found its way back to her, in the form of a sleek car pulling up slowly in front of the tower. And Clara didn't need to look twice to know who it was, because some things imprint themselves too deeply to ever be mistaken. And as her husband stepped out, followed by her sister, there was a moment where everything could have rushed back. The betrayal, the anger, the pain. But it didn't. Not the way it used to. Because Clara wasn't standing in that kitchen anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been left behind with nothing. She was someone else now. Someone who had rebuilt herself in the quiet spaces no one had seen. And she watched as they approached, their confidence replaced by something uncertain, almost fragile. "Clara," he said, his voice lacking the certainty it once had. "We heard about this place." And she nodded slightly, offering nothing more, because she didn't know them anything anymore. Not explanations, not emotions, not even her attention. And he glanced around, taking in the repaired walls, the steady movement of people inside, the sound of the clock ticking above them. "You did all this?" he asked, and Clara answered simply, "Yes." And the word carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it wasn't just about the tower. It was about everything she had survived to get there. And there was a pause before he spoke again, quieter this time. I made a mistake. And Clara studied him for a moment, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I know, she replied, and her sister shifted beside him, finally meeting Clara's eyes. We thought maybe we could fix things, she said, her voice uncertain, and Clara shook her head gently, not rejecting them with anger, but with something far more final. No, she said, and then, after a brief silence, she continued. I had nothing when I came here, not even a plan, just $9 in a place no one else wanted, and it forced me to build something real, something that didn't depend on anyone staying or leaving. And she glanced up at the clock as it chimed again, strong and steady. You didn't take my life, she added, meeting their gaze one last time. You just cleared the space for me to find it. And there was nothing they could say to that. No argument, no defense, because the truth had already settled between them. And for the first time, they were the ones standing on the outside, looking in at something they didn't understand, and Clara turned away without waiting for a response, stepping back toward the open doors of the tower where voices and quiet laughter filled the space, where people moved freely, unburdened by the weight of pretending to be okay. And as she crossed the threshold, the clock chimed once more, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but as a steady, unwavering rhythm of what had been rebuilt. And Clara didn't look back, because she no longer needed to. The life she thought had ended hadn't been taken from her. It had simply been waiting, hidden inside a broken tower, ready to begin again the moment she chose not to give up.